Welcome to Comforting Hearts Conversations. I'm your host, Anne Vlahos, best-selling author of To Die For, The Gifts of Being Present Through Loss and Grief. Today, we are joined by Clair Bidwell Smith. Welcome, Clair.
Hi, thank you.
Well, hey, I'd like to read a little bit about you. Clair is the author of 3 books of nonfiction, The Rules of Inheritance in 2012, After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? In 2015, and then the most recent one, Anxiety, The Missing Stages of Grief. So you have written for the New York Times, the Huffington Post, Salon, Slate, Chicago Public Radio, The Guardian, Psychology Today, Yoga Journal, and the BlackBook magazine. Clair has a bachelor's degree from the New School University and a master's degree from Antioch University. She's a licensed therapist and works with people around the world via her online programs and doing in-person, phone, and Skype grief counseling sessions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. So I am not even really quite sure how I ran across your material, because obviously with what I'm doing, I'm starting to do some reach out and found your books. I can honestly say that I probably could have used them probably about 5-6 years ago, more than right now.
I could have used them 20 years ago.
Oh my God, right? You know, and the things that I read at the time were more things that bummed me out versus things that kind of almost gave me a path. You know, I'd like to start off with reading a quote from your book, if that's okay. And I'm going to be reading from Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. There's 2 things probably. I will say this again. I have never met anyone who was able to escape the powerful experience of grief following a loss. Even those who push it away and think that they have mastered it or tamped it down and are moving on in their lives will often be surprised to have the grief show up down the road, still asking to be dealt with. So when someone asks me, how long will their grief last? I usually think about the ways in which they are embracing it in order to get an inkling of the duration that particular might experience. And I think that that's really profound. That's a question that I get asked frequently. How long is this going to last?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always the first thing because it's so painful. You know, people want to know how long it's going to take to get through it. They're so uncomfortable. They come to me when they're in an enormous amount of discomfort, and the first thing they want to know is, when is this going to be over?
Right. And it's interesting because I'm probably talking to people a little bit in a different stage, right? And I recognize probably from things that I went through myself, that I almost forgot that I went to like a group counseling session while my mom was in the hospital, that I worked with. You know, I had the phone counseling services as a benefit from work, which I highly recommend. And that really helped too, because I just thought, geez, am I not getting over this fast enough? You know, am I being too irritable to my family? Am I really unhappy in my relationships? Does work really stink? And really, that was not what it was. It was that I really just needed to talk to someone. And the way that my mom passed away, she was cooking lunch and her sleeve caught on fire, and so she had burns. And so it was a very difficult end. She lasted for 5 weeks. So during that time, I was not really around my family. I was very much intently with my mom. And so I didn't have the chance to kind of really tell that story very much during the way. So I would love to hear more about maybe where it's ideal. Where do you feel it's ideal for people to come in to seek grief counseling?
You know, that's a great question. I think it's actually like 6 months after a loss sometimes. In the first 6 months, there's not that much to be done. You know, it's just an enormous amount of pain. You're kind of riding a wave of pain those first 6 months, and there's nothing to really do. People come to me all the time in those first 6 months, but the most I can do is just hold space for them and listen and be there. And there's value in that, absolutely. But when people start to come in after the 4 to 6 month mark, that's when I think there's some real work that can be done. You're through the immediate pain, and now you're kind of ready to really review the relationship, review the death, like kind of start to work through the big things that are sitting with you. And you're also, by that time, really seeing how the loss has impacted your life. In the beginning, you can't really comprehend how much a significant loss is going to impact your life, all the different ways it's going to change your family, your relationships, your self-esteem, your finances. I mean, it's just so many things, as you know. But around the 6 months to the year mark, you have a much bigger picture of that. And there's more kind of work that can be done. But in the beginning, it's really, I think in the beginning, grief groups are almost better than one-on-one therapy, because you really just want to commiserate. You just want other people to bear witness to your pain. You want to be able to relate to other people who are also in that same pain. And there's just not that much to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does. It's kind of interesting because I always wondered when does it come in? And so I kind of go back to the thought that you had posed about grief, about anxiety being like another phase of grief. But for those that aren't really familiar with it, can you talk a little bit about Kubler-Ross? And we always hear about the 5 stages and a little bit about that and what it was really intended for, and how anxiety fits into that.
Yeah, I find Elizabeth Kubler-Ross such a fascinating character. She was a Swiss physician who was working in a Chicago hospital in the 60s, and she was working with patients who were dying and who were being given diagnosis, the terminal diagnoses, and were kind of facing that. And she crafted the 5 stages around someone who is facing death, not someone who is grieving.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was noticing that the experience of dying was not really being looked into or thought about by the doctors. And so she started bringing dying patients up on stage, interviewing them about their process, and just kind of bringing a more of an awareness to death and dying, which was really necessary. I love her work so much.
Mm-hmm.
Her 5 stages were so popular, and they make sense when you're dying. When you say you've just been given a terminal diagnosis, you would go through denial, right? Some amount of denial initially, then maybe some anger. You're angry that this is happening to you. Maybe then bargaining, which is, bargaining with the doctors, yourself, your higher power. If I do this or that, I promise if I, stop drinking forever, I will, maybe I'll get better, whatever it is. And then depression, you kind of start to realize that this is really happening and you slump into a depression. And then finally you come around to some level of acceptance. Those 5 stages work really well for someone who's dying. You do move through them in a linear process. You really often do go through those 5 in that order. The 5 stages grew so popular that they kind of got slapped onto the grief process as well. Mm-hmm. And Kubler-Ross even admitted this later, that they weren't really intended to completely define the grief process. They can, but they don't work as well in a linear fashion. They're not a perfect formula. You move through a lot of different emotions and stages when you're grieving. But because they became so popular, everybody knows about them, right? So when somebody is grieving for the first time, they're often like, wait, what are those 5 stages I'm supposed to go through, right? And they get excited about them because maybe it's this answer. Maybe if they do these 5 things, they will get out of this pain. We all kind of wish that were a perfect formula that we could follow. Unfortunately, it's not. So I've been working with clients for so long on just helping them understand and get educated about how grief works, because there's a lot of confusion around it based
Mm-hmm.
on the 5 stages.
And so that's an interesting thought. So are there phases you feel that it's just we jump different places with the grief phases?
I just think it's different for everybody. I think that you can go through many periods of denial throughout your grief process. I think you can go through many different periods of anger, depression. Bargaining is a tricky one. I think bargaining doesn't work as well when you're grieving, because the act has already happened. The person is gone. There's not much to bargain for at this point. There's some magical thinking that can sometimes go on. And I also think anxiety fits in there in a good spot. Anxiety has been an overlooked symptom for years now. And it's something that the majority of my clients suffer from after they go through a big loss. So that's one that's in there. But grief is very layered to me. I think we can swim in and out of a lot of these stages. I think we can linger in some. I think we skip some altogether. I know some clients who never got angry, or some clients who never really got depressed, So it's a little bit of it's just personal how it unfolds for people.
So how would somebody know the difference between when they're depressed or when they're actually heading into anxiety and needing more help?
I think when it's really impeding your life functioning, then but a certain level of depression is normal after a loss, of course. We should feel that. We should really steep in it a little bit too. That is the mourning period.
Mm.
It's uncomfortable. It's unlike anything else we've experienced in our life. When we are really sad, it's not comfortable, and it's not very supported by our society and our culture at large. When you're not getting out of bed and you're not seeing people that you normally see, or you're not taking care of yourself physically, your depression has reached that level, then you need some help. But if you find yourself in a slump for a period of weeks or months following a loss, that's normal and it's okay. Anxiety is trickier. Anxiety can be a bit insidious, once it gets in, it can build on itself and it can just kind of linger for a while. And sometimes we do have to take active measures to get a bit of control over the anxiety. So, yeah.
Yeah. I find that to be a really interesting thing. When you even talked about some of the experiences of yourself, like a panic attack that had happened, many, many, many years after things had happened with both your mom and your dad. And it was like, wow, where did this come from? And so I think it's a very unfamiliar feeling to some as well. And that should probably be a cue as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. When I was looking at, when I was reading one of your books, I also enjoyed the references to stories. And not until I think about 2 weeks ago, I was saying how grateful I was that I wrote a book that I felt I was, hopefully would help others as well. And she said, well, should you first maybe realize that you wrote the book for yourself? And I don't think until that moment that it all kind of clicked together for me that this was, the book was actually a major part of me doing the writing process that you talk about so clearly as a way to kind of release things. And, I'm not sure how I missed it, but, as you know, when you write a book, there's edits and then there's writing and there's more edits. And, you read it over again and again. And it was really an incredible opportunity to talk about, to really get those stories clear in my head and also to process things that I didn't think that I thought that had been long over, but still had obviously opportunities to reconnect. So I guess one of the questions I had for you is with the stories, we need to tell them, but how often do you find as people go through their stories that the stories are inaccurate, and that as they go through them, they learn the truth of the story?
All the time. I think every time. I mean, memory, history, it's revisionist, right? Like we remember things wrong all the time. Sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad, sometimes it's a coping mechanism. Most of the time it is. And it's important to really look at it. And that's what I love about therapy. People ask me a lot about my intersection of being a therapist and a writer, and they go hand in hand, in my opinion, because they're both about exploring narrative, right? We all have a narrative. We all have a story we tell ourselves. Sometimes we need to change that narrative. Sometimes we're walking around with a narrative that doesn't serve us, or it's inaccurate, or it's harmful in ways. And so going into therapy is often like really sitting down and exploring your own narrative and figuring out if it's the right one to be so attached to. So I love that. And I feel like being a writer and a natural storyteller, I can look at those things in kind of interesting ways.
Yeah, yeah. I had heard, I actually even tried this, the idea to sit down and set a clock for an hour and just put your pen to the paper. And in particular, when you're feeling, whether it's stressed or anger, it's something that needs to move, and to just write endlessly. Just have as much paper there. Don't take the pen off the paper. Just keep writing. Some of it makes sense, some of it's nonsense, and just keep going for the full hour that it's over. And then to take that writing and maybe to burn it, and to understand that, as the smoke blows away from you, that's carrying those thoughts away. And as some of it blows back, it's maybe bringing those, the values or the nuggets of gold back too. And I think I'm starting to realize, right? Kind of, it's painful sometimes to sit and just force yourself to write for that hour, but it was very much like a personal therapy session, because it wasn't even something that had to be revisited. It was a way to just really kind of release things in a way that was very private, and also very clearing, very clearing.
Yeah, absolutely. But what you said at the beginning of that is so true. Often we don't know what it is we're going to write or what's really going on inside of us until we sit down to do it. And it can be just be so cathartic and informative of like where we are in our psyche.
Yeah, yeah. Another connection that I found fascinating was where you talked about how the mind responds to things. And so it
Mhm.
responds to an event or what you write um, in a similar manner. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, our brains are very responsive to our emotions, and so and thoughts that we carry, and that's part of the anxiety work that I talk about doing. When the anxiety does get away from us, and we find ourselves dwelling. One of the most frequent things that happens after a significant loss when people do develop anxiety is they often find themselves having catastrophic thoughts. So they'll find themselves ruminating on other bad things happening, themselves getting cancer or their
Mhm.
children, something happening to them or their spouses. Um, and when we do that, we keep ourselves in a place of hypervigilance all the time. And our body really responds to it. And that's where the anxiety just keeps us on a loop. So when we start to really look at our thoughts and the sentences and the things that we dwell on, we can kind of figure out how to maneuver and move through the anxiety and not let it get so powerful.
Mm, that's really a clever way to help ourselves, right?
Mhm.
Um, how responsive are people to the idea of journaling?
They will do anything when they're anxious enough because they don't
Oh,
like anxiety.
okay.
Anxiety is awful. If you've ever struggled with it, or if you know somebody who has, it's just awful. It's the worst. So most people that come to see me, they are ready to try anything to get rid of their anxiety. It can be debilitating. It's almost like you wake up some mornings and you just feel like you're under this cloud of it, and everything just has this undercurrent of dread, and you start just constantly imagining worst case scenarios, and it is no way to live. So most of the people, or you're having panic attacks and you're ending up in the ER thinking you're having a heart attack or whatnot. And most people who come to see me are pretty desperate to be done with that and to move on. So they'll try the journal writing. They don't, they'll sometimes, I don't want to journal write, but they'll try it and it works.
Oh, that's really good. That's really
Yeah.
good. I remember in storytelling very clearly an experience where my sister came in and really kind of helped straighten me out very quickly. My dad was hard of hearing at the time, so he came quickly, but not probably. Who knows how quickly, right? There was no clock, there was no video cam watching. But I just said, boy, I wish Dad had hearing aids because then, maybe she wouldn't have been burned quite as bad. And she just really grabbed me at that moment and just said, wait a second, this isn't about any of those things. This is about, mom got injured. It was an accident and we're doing all that we can to make her better again. And I didn't realize that. And then it was interesting on the other side of that, my dad was saying, well, I'll get hearing aids when your mother gets better.
Hmm.
So, very similar kinds of, watching what that story, reading backward and where the story was and reading forward and saying what
Yeah.
I want the story to be. I find a lot of times that when people are not being present, that's where all the gifts are. But in the meantime, they're running back to where they wish this hadn't happened, or they're running forward at, like I said, telling that story and making up a story of where things might be. And you miss out so much on where things are, where you're at.
I
Um,
have a whole chapter on mindfulness in this new book because of exactly that. I think particularly when we're grieving, we are dwelling a lot in the past, or we're having anxiety about the future, because we're worrying about what life is going to be like without this person, or we're reviewing the past, what it was like, what we did wrong or didn't do. And very little time being present, because the present is also painful, right? We're sad. And so we're kind of running away from that. So I really encourage mindfulness when you're grieving. I think it's really helpful to get present.
For sure. I know when we were going through our parents' house after my father passed away, my sister had a quicker pace. She wanted to move through it quicker, and I slowed her down and said, "Hey, let's take this a little bit more slowly." And she graciously agreed, and it really helped me through the process. I felt that I was visiting them through their things and learning. But
Hmm.
for you, I'm curious, when you were so young, when both of your parents moved on, what was it like for you at that point to go through their things? Was it conscious? Was it rushed? What was your thought?
I don't even remember my mom's as much because it was so traumatic. My father kind of insisted on packing her things up pretty quickly. I kept a lot of stuff. I'm always surrounded by her things still, and they're very important to me. I'm always wearing something of hers, like my little earrings are hers today, and just different things like that. My father, after he was gone, it was hard. I was left in charge of his estate, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it forever. Every day I would get up and I would go drive over to his house, and I would just sit there on the couch, and I just couldn't bring myself to lift a finger. It was just so emotionally exhausting and overwhelming. Eventually my half brother had to come and just help me, and we kind of got it done in one weekend, because for like 6 months, I drove over to his house every day and did nothing.
Wow. Okay.
It was so hard. Some people are much more motivated to get it done, but yeah, it was just so difficult, so emotionally difficult.
Yeah. And then how about moving forward? Because I know you do talk a bit here too about, and your second book about developing or kind of really understanding and looking for and owning your own set of beliefs as to, what happens when you pass on. What inspired you to go on that journey?
I think it's an important part of it. I had been working in hospice for a number of years when I started doing that, and really seeing that the majority of my clients, some of their struggle came from not having any kind of foundation or construct with which to understand where their person had gone. And then the people that I met who did have some kind of strong belief or foundation or structural understanding of the afterlife seemed to have an easier time in their grief process. They felt like they had a place to put this in their heads. So I felt like, even for myself, I needed to go on a spiritual journey to understand my connection to where my parents were. And it really happened after I became a mom for the first time, where a lot of my anxiety came worrying that I would lose my daughters or they would lose me. And I needed to know where we would go if that happened. So it was really helpful to my own anxiety to kind of dive into it a bit and come up with my own spiritual framework.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's true. I had written something similar with when I was with my dad in the hospice process. I had some little booklets that I was reading. One was more physically based, one was a little bit more spiritually based. And they kind of started talking a little bit about birth being very similar to death, and the processes are very similar, right? Birth is messy. You don't know exactly when it's going to happen. You're not quite sure the outcome. You sort of know, but there's a lot of unknowns. And I think death is like that very much as well. But I kind of almost posed that, that transition within me was also very similar to being pregnant, right? So when you were pregnant and you're waiting, right, it was great. The baby went everywhere with you. You're talking to it, you're holding her. It was the best thing ever. But I remember after my first daughter, going away from the house for the first time and leaving her behind, it was the weirdest feeling. Like I couldn't touch her, I couldn't talk. There was still that bond and that connection, but she wasn't physically with me. And I almost think that death is like that in reverse. For me, it was about the 5-month mark where I really could say my mother's dead, and that she was safely resting in my heart by that point. And so it was almost like when I was pregnant with my daughter, it was like I was pregnant with the love of my mother and her presence in her heart. At first the body is an avatar, and then after that, maybe the gravesite or the tombstone, and then her things. But then eventually you recognize that it comes and it rests directly within your heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. It's
Yeah,
a journey, it really is. It unfolds in really particular ways to who you are and what your relationship was with your person.
Yeah. And I can imagine that, coming back to the stories, that someone who might have had a difficult time, it was a way to really kind of go back and revisit that and just understand, because in many ways after they're gone, it's not complicated by the issues that you dealt with in life. It's not complicated by the distance or the physical distance between you or the age difference or anything like that. It now all becomes very simple, and it can be about love if you choose it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So with looking at key learnings that some of our viewers might have as far as going through their grief process and knowing when to reach out for help, and when to maybe just approach things in their own way. Any last words of advice for them on that?
I think it's always great to get help with your grief process, whether it's just simply reading a few books about grief or memoirs by people who also lost someone similar, lost a spouse as well, or also lost a mom, or joining a grief group. I think that I say it a lot, grief is really lonely. And I think that our culture is not so great at it still. So you can tend to feel a little isolated in your grief process. So grief groups are so good for just kind of feeling like normalizing your feelings, feeling a little less alone, meeting other people who are sharing that same kind of emotional space. And then going to grief therapy if you really feel like there's some big stuff you need to work through, struggling with anxiety or guilt or depression. One-on-one therapy can be great for that. But I really think always some kind of grief support, books, listening to webinars, listening to podcasts like this, going to group therapy. It's great.
And how about if you're the spouse or the friend of someone who's now experiencing loss and grief? Any words of wisdom, what to say, what to do to help?
There's nothing you can say that's perfect. And there's, besides practical things, there's not always so much to do. The main thing is just to be able to really hold space, meet your friend, your family member exactly where they are. And if they want to talk about it a lot, then you can be there to listen. If they don't, then just be there, period. Let them know you're thinking about it. You don't have to have the answers. You just have to let them know that you are thinking about them and that aware that they're going through something. It's the best thing you can do.
Oh, that's great. And what books did you find really helpful?
God, I read everything. There's some great books out there these days, better than ever, just in the last 5 years. There's a great book called It's Okay That You're Not Okay, by Megan Devine that I really like. There's another nice one called Bearing the Unbearable. That's a really great book by Joanne Cacciatore. Motherless Daughters by Hope Edelman is great for mother loss. There's a Fatherless Daughters Project book for father loss. But there's so many things out there. I think these podcasts are great. There's so many. I've done more podcasts than ever with this new recent book, and there's so many exciting people just talking about grief and death and dying. I love it. It's going to be so good for our culture.
Right. Really making it a part of our life, right? We die once, we live every day.
Yeah, we got to talk about it.
Yep. Well, I have one last quote that I absolutely loved, and it's one sentence. And I think that this is an amazing, probably a snapshot of what we've just talked about. And the sentence is this: just because your person is gone does not mean that your relationship is over.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I really want people to understand that and think about that.
Yeah, and I think that there's so many things that I've seen people do as ways to remember, and we'll probably have a whole nother blog on how to remember and how to count those anniversaries and those days in a way that makes it a positive experience.
Definitely.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, again, I'd love to say thank you so much, Claire, for joining me today to talk about this. This is a great topic, and I would highly encourage people to read the book. I think that it's incredibly clarifying, and also gives very, very practical advice for how to move forward with anxiety dealing with loss.
Thank you.
Also, could you tell our guests how to connect with you?
ClairBidwellSmith.com. You can find all the things there.
Okay, great. And we'll also have your website underneath the page as well. So thank you so much for joining us on Comforting Hearts Conversations, where we take on that tough subject to help you find your way and navigate your own path through loss and grief. So thank you so much for joining us. And from our hearts to yours, have a great day.